How do you spot an extremist? The Black Lives Matter protests have taken place all over the world, and there's been a fair bit of rioting, looting, etc., and also a great deal of peaceful protest. In Glasgow, there was a protest in George Square. It ended up with Robert Peel's statue being graffitied with this ACAB, all cops are bastards message, communist hammer and sickle. But when the media reports it, generally, these protesters are generally labelled as anti-racism protesters, and they're given a fairly sympathetic reporting in the media. Very great deal of understanding. And there was another similar themed protest in Glasgow on Saturday about asylum seekers welcome, refugees welcome. Although I'd hope everyone would welcome asylum seekers and refugees. Though that's not to say that we think there's, how many of them ought to come to the country. But is that what the protest's really about? Is about other things as well?
No borders, no nation, stop deportations!
No nations, no borders. I mean, how does that work? What, they want a world government? So unlimited immigration? This is a pretty radical view. What else are they all about?
Okay, and we've got one thing to say to anyone who thinks they can take over our city who's not anti-racist. Whose streets? Our streets. Whose streets? Our streets. Whose city? Our city. Whose city? Our city.
Our streets, that sounds a bit confrontational. That sounds a bit like if other people come and try and make their views heard on the streets, we will, well, who knows? They won't allow that to happen.
No justice! No peace! 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 No justice! No peace!
No justice, no peace. That sounds a bit threatening to me. In other words, if we don't get what we want, there's not going to be peace. Does that mean we're going to riot or whatever? I don't know, but it just sounds a bit threatening to me. But with these things, the BBC always presents it from their particular perspective. The media in general does violence of these sort of things. It's often sort of blamed on the police, blamed on counter-demonstrators. Whereas these events often include elements that would be quite right to describe as far left and in some cases pretty thuggish individuals. Now listen to these charmers, for example. And also, in addition to that, obviously this whole demonstration is completely breaking the lockdown rules.
But I think we are in a key moment in time where we have a reminder too of the races that exist and how organised they are. Football supporters and far-right extremists have vowed to counter Black Lives Matter protests and keep vigils around war memorials and statues.
So great concern about the mass ranks of the far-right racists and their high levels of organisation. But to be honest, getting a few dozen blokes to turn up in George Square doesn't exactly constitute a feat of logistical brilliance. But anyway, so these people are describing themselves as statue defenders, and yet they've been described in the Parliament and the media as racist thugs. So what they say they're doing is not taking at face value, they're given another label, which doesn't seem to happen with other types of protests. So these so-called far-right thugs, I mean, defending the cenotaph, does that make someone far-right? So you can see the people are poised to be quite condemning of this group. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't really know who these people are. I mean, there's obviously some of them are thugs. You can see the way they behave. But it's quite interesting to see the split in the media. They're so hot on sort of far-right extremism and so blind to far-left extremism. I mean, the reason's obvious, isn't it? It's because the media are pretty left themselves. But you see the same sort of attitudes coming out in the Parliament as well. I mean, listen to these couple of tweets. The leader of Glasgow City Council, disappointing and worrying statement. Please do keep enforcing coronavirus laws and need to socially distance. But to say peaceless asylum seekers and far-right thugs are as bad as each other is simply wrong. It's the latter Glasgow needs our police to protect the city from. And Humza Yousaf, the Justice Secretary, I sent out a statement to Justice Secretary saying people should not gather for Black Lives Matter protests. On daily briefing, next day reiterated it was against the rules. That continues to be the message. That aside, there's no moral equivalence between violent racists and anti-racists protesting peacefully. So Humza Yousaf talks about violent racist thugs and non-violent asylum seeker protesters. What's missing? I assume he thinks the other options don't actually exist. The other options are violent refugee, Black Lives Matter, whatever, protesters, or peaceful statue war memorial defenders. So the Police Federation, which represents almost all police officers in Scotland, had something to say about what they perceived as this political partiality. Let's read some of the letter. It's simply unacceptable that individuals and groups can consider that gathering together under the guise of any particular cause in the midst of a global health pandemic is in any way justifiable. Those who gather are breaking the law, pure and simple. It ought to be the easiest thing in the world for all politicians to coalesce behind this simple message without equivocation. For the past few weeks we've seen so much mealy-mouthed language to avoid stating of the obvious. At the same time, as a family is unable to have more than 10 people mourn the death of a loved one, hundreds and thousands are able to gather with impunity and without criticism simply by carrying a banner or a placard. And the Police Federation went on to say, when our politicians fail to condemn the actions of those who defy the law, we cannot be surprised that it is increasingly difficult for police officers to enforce the law. And this is the real punchline. The public cannot expect the police service to turn a blind eye to those who break the law in the name of a particular cause while demanding different treatment for opponents. I was talking to a retired police officer a few months ago, and he was saying if they were policing some sort of demonstration from a sort of standard left-wing cause, the briefing would be, go really easy, we've got a no arrest policy today, let's just try and keep things subdued, let's stay in the background. If it was some sort of what they perceive to be some sort of far-right group, then the message was, these people are the scum of the earth. Just go, if anyone puts a foot out of line, just grab them and throw them in the back of the van.
Nobody's falling for your rubbish. Not a single person believes that you're out there to protect a statue. Nobody needs you to protect a statue. The police will do a job when it comes to vandalism. That you are simply using that as a pretense and as an excuse to engage in thuggery and violence and knuckle-dragging racist behaviour, and it will not be tolerated any longer. It shouldn't have been tolerated, it shouldn't be tolerated, it should never be tolerated. So you can expect to feel the full force of the law, engage in that behaviour, and you will see the inside of a custody cell.
Well, Humza Yousaf needs reminding that the police's job is to police actions, not politics. Nicola Sturgeon was coming out with the same sort of thing as well, that these racist thugs would feel the full force of the law. Shouldn't everyone feel the full force of the law? If you turn up in George Square with a can of spray paint trying to vandalise statues, shouldn't you feel the full force of the law? If you're there singing Rule Britannia and, being a bit of a thug alongside it, should you feel the full force of the law? Of course you should. These protesters are called racist. I don't know who they are. Maybe they are, I don't know. But I haven't seen any evidence of that. There does seem to be a thuggish element there. But Humza Yousaf calls them knuckle draggers. I would never use that sort of term. I wouldn't talk about a fellow human being in that way. I would criticise people's evil actions in no uncertain terms. I would criticise their character. And I would say they're completely wrong about what they believe. But that's as far as you go. But the problem with calling people knuckle draggers, who invented that insult? What's it mean? It means less advanced in an evolutionary sense. Where does that sort of idea come from? It comes from racists. So I think actually using that sort of term when you're trying to oppose racism is not really a smart idea. So Humza Yousaf, if he were to hear someone describing Islamic terrorists as animals or monsters, he probably wouldn't be too happy. He certainly wouldn't use those terms himself. And if he heard those terms, he'd probably think, I wonder if there's a bit of racism or whatever lurking below. But Humza Yousaf is the Justice Secretary. It's his job to be impartial, to reassure people that he's being impartial. But another issue here, those people who they're being called racist, maybe some of them are, I don't know. But maybe there's some people there who are just on the fringes of that movement. They just went along with someone, they don't really know where they stand. Does Humza Yousaf not want to win them over? But if he uses those sort of dehumanising terms, that's just going to alienate people and cement people in their positions. And also, using that sort of derogatory language about people does actually stir up hatred, which I shouldn't think should be a crime. Humza Yousaf thinks it should be, but stirring up hatred does not help. So the next time there's a demonstration, if that group turns up, Humza Yousaf's words will make it much more likely that there will be a violent confrontation where other people feel emboldened that these knuckle draggers deserve all they get. So that's not exactly helpful, is it, Mr. Yousaf? So it's time for the video to do what it says on the tin. We're going to identify an extremist, and our case study is going to be the Scottish Greens leader, Patrick Harvie.
So the Black Lives Matter movement, in all its expressions, is necessary, urgent, and demands our support.
So it supports all expressions of the Black Lives Matter protests, so that includes rioting, looting, attacking the police, cities ablaze. He thinks it's all great.
While clearly also praising those police forces which have chosen to take a low-key, non-provocative response when protests do take place. Unlike, for example, what we've seen in London, with some protesters kettled to be unable to observe social distancing because of the kettling.
You know what his line is going to be, don't you? It's all the police's fault. Not a hint of balance, not the slightest suggestion that any protester might have been at fault in any way at all. Now, the last bit is just so ridiculous. I mean, it's funny, isn't it? To suggest that these people going on the protest have then got just cause to complain that the police squashed them together so they couldn't social distance in the way they intended to when they went to take part.
The call to defund the police should be no way controversial compared with the defunding of education, the defunding of healthcare, and the defunding of housing, which has been endured disproportionately by black communities.
I mean, defund the police, that's completely bonkers. I mean, the Scottish Green Party is the political wing of the all cops are bastards movement in Scotland. So then Patrick Harvie is a dangerous character, but is he an extremist? Let's see about that. Now, my little method for spotting extremists here, I'm taking the idea from Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind. It's a good book, recommend that. I'll maybe make a video about it one day. He talks about 6 different political, he calls them tastes, that's not a great word, sentiments or values that we can look at. And people with different political outlooks put different weight on these different values. So a different balance gives different political outlooks. Now, in some ways, these values all have their place, and we need the diversity of perspectives. We need all sorts in politics to some degree. But what makes an extremist? Now, the line I'm going to take is an extremist is someone, if you take the normal scale being, say, 0 to 10, 0, no interest in that value at all, 10, that's really, really central to you, then that's the range of normal politics. If you actually go into the negative, or go over 10, then you're into extremism. Now, I'm going to pick a couple of these areas that Jonathan Haidt talks about. And the first one I'm going to use is loyalty. So this refers to patriotism, commitment to the community that's your nation. Now, in Scotland, obviously, Scotland and Britain, this area is a bit of a mess because Scottish nationalism, national identity is a disputed concept. But it would cover as well sort of honouring your history, cherishing your culture and traditions. So someone who was a 0 on the loyalty scale, they would be a complete internationalist. They would have no interest at all in national identity, no pride in their country and its traditions. They don't really feel part of this community in particular. And they would be very willing to be critical of the nation and its history. They would probably be someone who would want to remain in the EU. And even being in the EU would just be a stepping stone to the whole thing being dissolved into the United Nations. Right, if you went right to the other end, someone who'd be at 10 on the loyalty thing, they would be a real patriot. They'd probably be a Brexit voter, defending the nation, culture, heritage. I mean, a war memorial would be something of real importance to them. So that's the 0 to 10 scale. But if you're an extremist, you might go off the ends of the scale. How about if you go negative? That would go that you're not just indifferent about your nation, you would be actively hostile to your own nation. You would hate your own nation. You would explicitly reject your own national identity. You wouldn't just be even-handed with your criticism. You would have a special criticism, special fervour in criticising your own nation. You want to tear down its traditions. If you went off the other end, the 10 plus end, then that turns into not just celebration of your own identity, it turns into hostility towards others. And that could lead into racism and xenophobia. Right, the other area I want to look at is authority. Now, the authority value, that's the idea that you accept the structures necessary in society and there's need for some form of hierarchy and control. Now, someone's at a 0 on this in this area, that would mean they'd really want minimal, soft policing, say. They think that's the way to get people to behave best, to make the most harmonious society. Whereas if you enter up with people at number 10, they'd be more saying, no, we need rigorously enforced rules. We need that structure in order for society to function. Okay, that's the political spectrum. How about if you go off the ends into the extremes? If you go off the extreme of the negative, instead of just thinking that soft policing is the best way, you actually go over to being on the side of the criminals, and you willfully tear down the necessary authorities out of principle, even though you know that that's not going to lead to good outcomes. If you go off the other end of the scale, 10 plus, then you're heading into repression, that you're keeping the people down and cowed, not to create a safe and positive society, but for your own benefit. And that's what you call tyranny. So how does Patrick Harvie fare on those scales? Let's go to loyalty first of all. He's definitely off the negative end of the spectrum. He is especially hostile to his own nation, his own culture. He delights in criticising it. I mean, in the slavery debate recently, he talked about the abolitionists, which surely should be a source of pride for people in Britain, but he was just critical of them. Not a good word to say, critical. If you look at the Green Party, we had Ross Greer, who really kicked off the anti-Churchill attack in the public domain a few months ago. And that's just an example of this sort of negative loyalty. When it comes to authority, where is he on the spectrum? Again, he would say he's on the negative end. He's defending criminals while delighting in attacking the police and proper authority. So on the basis of my little method there, Patrick Harvie is a left-wing extremist. You don't need to throw things at the police to be an extremist. Now, I've picked on Patrick Harvie there. You may say a soft target. How about the rest of the MSPs? Well, just remember, where the Greens lead, the rest of them follow. The Conservatives might be back of the queue, but they get there eventually. Okay, thanks for watching.